I am so excited to be bringing this piece and technique to you today. I can't wait to teach you how to take your serif letters, combine it with watercolor and a shadow to make a gorgeous, stunning piece just in time for Valentine's Day or any time of the year. To create this piece, you're going to need a few different things. First of all, you're going to need a pencil. I have the Tombow 2B pencil. I like this one because it doesn't smudge as much as many other dark pencils do. I also have this creepy moldable eraser, and it's super creepy. But one really nice thing about using it is it doesn't leave little eraser bits anywhere, so you won't get those stuck into your painting. It's also a good way to lighten up your pencil marks without fully erasing them. Then I have a Winsor & Newton size 6 paintbrush. The reason I'm using one that's so large is because I'll be able to cover a lot of space really quickly before any paint dries. We're going to be using these Ecoline liquid watercolors, and the colors that I've chosen for this are number 236, 334, 545, and 337. And these are linked below. Now, of course, if you have supplies that are slightly different than what I have here, you can still use the techniques I'm going to be showing you. But just so you know exactly what I'll be using, if you want to follow along precisely, this is what you've got to have. Now, the other things that I'm going to use are a little paint palette. I have 2 cups of water, one for clean washes and one for my dirty paintbrush to go into. And I'm going to be using Strathmore Ready Cut watercolor paper. That's for no reason in particular than it was in my stash, but it's a nice cold press paper and it comes in this perfect 8x10 size. Of course, you can use other watercolor papers. Cold pressed is usually best, and I like the 8x10 because then it's ready to go into a frame. I have a paintbrush blotting towel, and you can see I've used it for a few things, but I actually think it's really pretty, so I like it. And then I'm using an Omnigrid ruler. This is more important if you want to do your lettering from scratch and you want to make sure your sizing is correct. But because I wanted to make it easy for you, I have also included a tracer for you. Now, in order to use the tracer, of course, you're going to need some way to transfer that onto your new piece of paper. So I'll be using how do you even say this? Because a DB and an M don't go together in the English language. I have no idea. It's a light box. I'll link to it below. Now, if you don't have a nice big light box or any light box to use, you can always use tracing on the window. That's a perfectly fine option. Or putting your iPad underneath, just setting it to your notes screen and keeping it there with all of its brightness turned up. That's a great way to be able to get some light behind your piece so that you can trace. Now that you have all of your materials ready, let's get started creating our love piece. I created these letters so that they're about 2 inches wide and 3 inches high. That makes them a nice good size, but then also I overlap them a little bit. So with your watercolor, that can be a little bit tricky because if your watercolor is at all wet, they're going to blend together. Now, that means that you're going to need patience for this project, and while I am not known for having lots of patience, it will pay off if you just hang on a second and make sure that your paint is completely dry before moving on to your next step. You want to go through and trace over the letters. Now, when you're tracing, don't put pressure onto the page because that will create a divot in your paper. You're really just looking to get the suggestion of where your paint should be flowing. Get a light, gentle mark onto your page, and you don't even need to worry about making sure that your line is complete because we are going to be going through and erasing this a little bit more before you add paint to it. I don't want it to be super obvious that we traced this, so that's why we will be going through and just gently erasing the lines so that it's just a suggestion of a line and not really something there. While you're tracing, try to get those nice straight lines, and you want to make sure that you're getting the curves in the edges of the letters as well. So go straight line and then curve into your next straight line. If you're having trouble with getting those curves in there, I would suggest going through, drawing all your straight lines first, and then kneading up in the corners with a gentle curve. Remember, this is also just a guideline for where your paint's gonna go. Hopefully it'll stay relatively close to your guides, but you can always use a little bit of artistic license. Once you have your trace done, your pencil can go to the side, you're all done with your light box, and you're gonna pull out that eraser. And it's gonna seem a little counterproductive to the fact that we just drew all of that on there, but go through, and any place where the line is quite dark, you want to simply erase that off just a little bit so that underneath you still have the suggestion of the line without a whole bunch of pencil showing through. Now you might say, well, why didn't you use a lighter pencil in the first place? That's a great question. And there's a method to my madness. Usually if you're using a lighter pencil, that means that it has harder lead. So you're going to be pushing a little bit harder and probably getting divots on your page. With using the softer lead pencil, sure, you get the darker marks and you have to erase them a little bit, but you also make sure that you don't dent your paper in any way. Now it's time for us to add paint. One of the amazing things about watercolor is the way that paint can flow within the space you've painted. You can use water to change the tone, you can add more paint to make it darker, more saturated, and because it can flow so easily, we're gonna have to chop this up into bits. So first, we're gonna paint the L and the V, and then we're gonna let it dry. And then we're gonna come back and do the O and the E, then we're gonna let it dry. Then we're gonna come back and put the shadow on top of all of them, and the shadow underneath. So it's going to take 3 stages of letting it dry, but I promise it'll be worth it. That way you won't have any bleed through in your piece, but you'll make sure that you have solid, gorgeous watercolor letters. Now you're gonna say, well, what's the fun of watercolor if we're not having that blending? But you're going to have that blending within each of the letters. We're just not pulling it all the way through. So let's get started with the L. Now you are gonna have to work quite quickly because you don't want any of the paint to dry on your L before you have a chance to add some water and push the paint out to the side. What do I mean by that? Well, let's do it. You want to fill your paintbrush with water, so make sure that you're swishing it around inside. Swish, swish, swish. You don't have to make that noise. It doesn't need to make noise. And then just tap it off on the edge. Now, my brush is full of water, so that means that I'll have a lot to use in my L, and I also want to get my brush full of paint. So I'm gonna dip it into the paint twice, and you can see I have paint filling the end here, and it goes all the way up to here. That's great, my brush is loaded. Now you want to paint as quickly as possible through your L. Put a whole bunch of paint right down in that main part of your L. Get out to your edges and get those curves in there. So I'm really trying to work fast. You're gonna wanna go as quickly as possible while making sure that you're in control of your strokes so that none of the edges of your paint and water have a chance to dry. I find it easier to flip my paper as I'm working so that I can do the straight lines going down the other side. And if that works for you too, that's a great trick. I'll quickly paint down here, and then I'm going to turn it over before it dries. Get all the way up in there, pull across, and you want to try to get those nice straight lines. Oh, see, it's already starting to dry there. So I'm going to blend it out, and then I'll go up and try to get that straight line. Getting up into this corner. And now it doesn't look very exciting because it's all pretty much just the same. But wash your paintbrush off, and then let's do some magic. So wash it off in your dirty cup, and then you're going to pick up some clean water and drop it into the center of the thick part of your L. Just drop that water in there, and then use that water to gently push the paint out to the sides of your letter. So I'm going to push it out even this way. And one thing though, as you're doing it, you might notice that I'm starting to pick up a lot of red in my brush. So I want to keep washing it off and using clean water to continue to push that paint around. So you're in control of your paint. You want to create this light area in the center and push the dark out to the edges. One other thing that you can do, if you start to have too much water happening inside here, or you want it to be lighter, is dry off your brush. And with a dry brush, you can suck up some of that water and paint, especially in that main area. So I'll dry off my brush again and then suck up a little bit more. It's just wicking that water away. It's almost like a bit of a vacuum. And I want to create with this that lightness in the center with nice dark edges. Now, if you feel like your edges aren't dark enough, you can take a very little bit. I'm just dipping the very tip of my brush into the paint. I'll tap it off because I don't want any paint drops to fall. And then you can drop just on the very edges in some areas of your letter. If you don't feel like you have enough depth there, or like it's maybe not dark enough, just tap around those edges and get a little bit more of that saturation happening. Now, if that saturation is starting to work its way out into the center, you're going to combat that with a touch of water. So I'll just finish dropping it, clean off my brush, make sure it's full of clean water, and then I'll drop some water in the center just to force that saturation back out to the edge. So when you're doing this, you're looking for the edges to be darker than the center and for it to almost look like it's glowing from the middle. You do that by getting all of your paint on there really quickly, and then with a clean paintbrush, dropping some water into the middle. Once you have that clean paintbrush and just water, you can press that paint out to the edge so that you'll get that nice dark outline to your letter. Let's move on to V. I'll just keep it upside down because I'm going to be flipping it later anyways. And for this one, I'm going to use 236. This is a nice light orange color. I like the way that it pops. It's kind of a happy color. And again, I want to make sure, because I have been just touching this, that I have a nice clean brush, especially when you're going from a darker color into a lighter color. Make sure that your brush is completely clean. So again, I'm swishing around to fill my paintbrush up, and then you just want to dab off on the edge to get any of those drops that might fall off of your brush. So it's full of water. I'm also going to fill it with some paint. And now it's time for some speed painting. Get a lot of paint down in that center area. Try to get your lines down as quickly as possible. And remember that it can be very, very helpful to flip your painting to get those nice straight lines. I'll paint along the top here. This is also part of why I'm using a large brush and why I suggest that you do the same, because you can cover so much more space much more quickly, and hopefully then your paint won't be dry by the time that you finish the letter. So I'll get this side. Ah! Make sure you're not touching the other letter with your hand. That can just be a mess. Get that side. Blend this all the way down to the bottom. And then remember to use that trick of flipping your page to get nice straight lines. I find for me it's a lot easier if I'm pulling towards myself for those straight lines. So that's why I like to turn the page a little bit. Okay, now that I have the paint all filling that letter. Oh, I missed a little bit under the E. There we go. I'm going to clean it off, fill it up with some plain water, tap the edge, and then drop in there to push that paint out to the side of the letter. Oh, I just did that into my clean water. Tisk, tisk. Okay. There we go. Sometimes you need to add just a little bit more water to make sure that you're getting those extremes of the light and the dark, and push it up even these smaller branches of your letter so that you get that variation happening in there as well. go. I don't actually suggest holding your water container over top of your painting as you're doing this because you will get a few splatters, but I'm just doing that so that I can show you which water I'm trying to use here. Now, I ended up going a little bit out of the line there, so I'm going to just try to straighten it out a little bit, ever so slightly. And then remember your hoover trick, so clean off your brush. Make sure it's nice and dry, and you can hoover up some of the water and some of the paint that's happening in the middle. That'll give you that nice lightness. I guess we could also call it the vacuum trick, but hoover just sounds so fun. There we go. 2 letters done. Now you need to wait for this to dry completely before you move on to the other letters. Even if you think it's almost dry or it's pretty good, as soon as those 2 paints touch together, it's going to start to blend. So leave this be, let it completely dry. I don't know, go chase your kids around the house for a little while or something, and then come back and you can work on the next 2 letters. I went and got clean water again because I definitely, in my rush, was putting my paint into the clean water. So that's set and ready to go. This is fully dry, and now we're ready for our last 2 letters. Now, one thing I notice is I'm getting some of these dry lines happening in here, and that's usually something that happens if you're not pushing your water paint all the way out to the very edge. So it had started to dry around the edge here a little bit, and I didn't rehydrate that when I added more water. That's okay. I think that it adds to the look of it, and when you add the shadow inside, you're not even going to see that. Now, this really has accomplished, though, those nice dark edges with the lightness on the inside. There's some variation to the color inside the letters, so they're really interesting to look at. All right, 2 more. And again, we're going to use that technique where we're filling our paintbrush up with lots of paint, painting as fast as possible, and then adding water afterwards to lighten up that center bit and push the paint out to the side. So fill up your brush with water, tap it off just a little bit, and then I'll dab into the purple twice. Get it nice and full, and I'm going to dab off just a touch. I don't want to dab too much because I don't want to put lots of water into the paint, but just enough that I'm not going to drip all over my piece. So get all the way down. Sometimes I leave it to the end when I'm getting right up to the letter because I have to go slower and I want to get as much paint onto the letter as possible. So that's a trick that you can use as well. So paint out, get close. Now it's better to leave a touch of white there than to actually overlap because you don't want to lose that beautiful darkness on the O. Again, of course, you can turn your page to make it easier to get those lines in, but we want to do it really quickly before any of this paint dries. Especially with it being a darker color, it won't be quite as forgiving if it dries. All right, get all the way around. Perfect. It's time to add the water, so clean off your brush in your dirty water cup, pick up some nice clean water, and let's drop it in. So I'm dropping and pushing at the same time to try to create that nice light area. Look at that, putting paint into the water again. The learning curve is not steep for me. It's pretty much a straight line sometimes. And again, I want to make sure that that water gets pushed all the way out to the side so that I don't end up with these dry lines in the same way. Clean off that brush, get some clean water, and drop even more water into the center there. even though there's not a lot of space here on the side of the L, you still want to add a bit of variety. So I'm just pushing that paint through so that it's lighter in there. Again, the learning curve. Now I have quite a puddle happening up here. So if that happens to you, remember the Hoover trick. Just get in there with a dry brush and you can pick up some of that paint. So drying my paintbrush off, and then I'm just going to go through the middle and pick up some of the paint. If you don't go too close to the edge, you'll still have that nice amount of paint around the edge with that lightness in the center. So I'm just sucking some of that up. That'll also help to create more distinction and difference between the lights and the darks. So now I'm going to touch in, just pick up a tiny bit of purple. I feel like this edge can use a little bit of some deeper color. Just a tiny bit, and then you can just dab it right onto the edge. Get a little more there. I'm going to get some more down at the bottom. And you don't have to dab it on evenly as well. You can put some over here, you can put some in the middle here, and then go back with a nice clean brush, some clean water, and just blend it out again. Dab on, force the paint to get to the edge so that you can create that nice dark outline. Now it's time for our last letter in my favorite color, pink. So fill up your paintbrush. Hopefully have it open first. There we go. Should have done that in a different order, but that's okay. So my paintbrush is still nice and full of water. I'm going to dip in twice to the paint. Let's do this. Painting out the letter as quickly as possible. Trying to keep those nice straight lines. Getting the curve in there. And then I'll do the tops of these straight lines. It's easiest sometimes to go one direction, easier than the other way. And then remember, just turn your page and do the other side as well. So I'll flip and then go the other direction. Now, one thing you want to watch out for is how you're resting your hand on the page so that you're not resting your hand in the letter that you've just done. And that's something I still do regularly. So again, not a steep learning curve for that one for me, but I'm sure you'll do better than I will. All right, I feel like this one's taking a long time. If you feel like one is taking you a while, go back to the paint that's sitting on an edge and just shift it around. Even if that's not the part you're going to work on, if you keep it shifting, then you won't end up with a line that might be happening because it's drying. So just go back, paint it around a little bit, and then you can continue working on the area you're first working on. All right, now it's time for the clean water. So clean off the brush, pull out your clean water, and start dropping and pushing. Don't be afraid to shift that paint around, push it around. You're the boss. It's not the boss of you. And really lighten up in that middle bit. Okay, I'll go in with a little bit more clean water. And then use that Hoover technique. So now that the centers are a bit lighter, let's make it even more pronounced. Dry off your brush. And Hoover. This is also good to make sure that you don't have too much water on your paper, and it will cut down on drying time, which is really nice, because if you have this big puddle here, it's just going to take so much longer to dry. So sure, when you Hoover, you are pulling up some of the pigment, but remember, you can always go in and drop in more saturation along those edges. So Hoover in a little bit more. And then let's drop in a bit more pigment just along the edges. There we go. And then we'll just blend it out a little bit with a touch of clean water, just to force it to have that natural blend to the edge. All right, again, we have 2 more letters done, which means they're all done, and now it's time to wait. So put it to the side, go, I don't know, watch a television show, sounds good to me. Put it to the side, let it fully dry before we come back and add some shadow to the inside of the letters and some shadow to the outside. Now that it's fully dry, we can go in and add the final touches to make it pop off the page, and that is the shadows. Now you can continue to use your size 6 brush or a smaller one like a 2 for the lines that we're going to do on the inside. Of course, you could use a 1 or a 0 too. Anything smaller is fine. Because we want these to be nice and dark, we're going to use the full strength of the paint. So that means that you want to have no water in your brush, or just enough so that it's wet, but not enough that it's holding on to a lot of water. Let's see, I'm trying to decide if I should be gutsy and just go with the thick one, or if I should just play it safe and go with a small one. We'll try some of each. Okay, I'm gonna get my paintbrush just wet so that it's usable, and then dry it off a little bit. And when you're drying it off, pull it towards yourself so that you're not pushing the bristles in the direction that they should never be going. And then you want to dip straight into your paint so that you're filling up just with really saturated paint. I'm going to tap on the edge of my pot, and the reason that you want to do that is because you don't want any of this dripping off. You can always, and you're going to be adding a lot more paint just to these simple lines, but don't get any drips happening on your piece. Now you want to do the shadow line as if this letter was just getting inset. So we want it to go down and slightly to the side. So if we have a line here, we're going to do one down below it. So just paint right below. You want to leave a little bit of space. And then after you've put in your first line there, you can go and touch it with more paint, and that will increase the saturation. So paint it, and then because we also want it to go to the side, we'll paint down this side. So when you're doing your shadow, you want to paint below straight lines and to the, what is this, right of your lines on the left. And I'm just dropping more paint in to make it even more pronounced. So now this left-hand side, we're going to do a line to the right, all the way down. And I'm leaving again a little bit of space on the edge so that you can see the dark edge with a little bit of lightness before the shadow line comes in. And then once the line is there, you can drop more paint. Now, because you've already painted the line, the more saturated paint knows exactly where to flow, so you don't have to worry about it using a mind of its own and going wherever it wants. So let's paint up the side here. Now this is tricky because you do have to be more controlled, but thankfully you have more time than you did when you were trying to do the entire letter. So that's a plus. All right, and again, I'm dropping a little more paint so that when it dries, it's going to be really saturated. So here we have another top line. We'll paint just underneath. Don't get too close to the edge of the letter. And then we have a left-hand side, so let's paint to the right. So I've also included a little diagram for you of exactly where these shadows should go, and hopefully that will help get them into the right place for you. So drop some more paint on to get it really saturated, and I want to soften this little corner here out. So my size 2 brush is a little too big for this. I'm going to use actually my larger brush, which seems weird, but it has a more pointed edge. There's more of a point to the tip than this one. This is just fully rounded. So this will allow me to get a more precise corner. That's something that you want to watch for when you're picking your brush. If it's, this one's still a round brush, but it just has a slightly different tip to it. So add lots of paint so that it's nice and saturated, and then we're going to move on to the next letter. Now, because I'm right-handed, I'm going to work from left to right so that I'm not placing my hand in it. If you're left-handed, I would suggest working from right to left. For the next letters, we're going to do the same thing, following that key of taking top lines and left lines and shifting down and to the right. Remember that you want to place it on slowly. Once you get your paint on there, then you can go back with full strength, tap it in, and get a nice, fully saturated line. Now, to create the shadow that goes underneath the letters, just to make them look even more dimensional, you want to have a light version of the paint that's on the inside. So we used sort of the medium with the variegated, then we used super saturated for the lines inside, and now we're going to use super light to do a shadow down below. If you're not very comfortable with a shadow, you can, of course, use the guideline that I provided for you. Or another thing that you can do is go through and off all the corners, you want to draw a line that is roughly the same angle and length all the way through your piece so that you can see where you should create your shadow. Then maybe that's what is that, like ½ inch? Then you just go through and connect all of those up. ½ inch. This is something that Stefan really goes into in his Letter Like a Legend course. So if you're interested in learning a lot more about shadow techniques and 3D lettering, that's the course you're going to want to look at. Now that all of the guidelines are drawn in, we need to create our perfect paint for this. So take your little palette and you want to put just some plain water into 4 sections. So I already have a bit of paint here, but let's do one in the middle as well so I can show you. Again, with the sound effects. I don't know where those come from. So I've put enough water into these to give me a little bit of paint, not a lot. You want to then put your paintbrush into one of your pots, pull up just a touch of paint and drop it in to your water. Now, you want to go with just a little bit at a time because we want to make sure that it's still really nice and light. So I've just wiped my paintbrush off here and I'm going to mix up this paint. And it looks really, really light. But take an extra piece of watercolor paper and paint with it. Because until you put it on paper, sometimes you don't actually know what it's going to look like. So we want it to be really, really light underneath here. And I think this might be a touch too light. So I'll put another little tiny bit of paint in here, mix it around, and then again, test it out. I think I want something in between those two. So I'll put a little bit more water. And that looks perfect there. You can see that I've used this one to test out some other paints. I just keep using the same piece of paper over and over, both sides, because that way at least you're not really wasting a piece. So we're going to paint in the shadow here, and you don't want to paint all the way up to the letter. We want to leave just a little bit of white in between. And then paint around. And again, you'll probably want to go through, I forgot to do this, you'll want to go through and erase some of those marks so that they're not quite as obvious. So I'll do it for my other ones. Remember though that those lines are still a little bit wet, so keep away from them. And then again, paint the other shadow portions, keeping a little bit of white in between, and then finish off. And you can see that this looks like it's much more watery than when we were first doing the letters, but that's totally fine. It will dry and you'll get a beautiful light version of the color you used on the inside. We're going to do the same thing for the other colors, making sure that it's a lighter shade, even lighter than what you have in the middle, and testing it on some paper. Once you have it tested, you found your perfect shade, you can go in and paint out all of those shadows. Now, once this is fully dry, you already have it the perfect 8x10 size, so you can slap it up in a frame. Or another thing that you could always think about doing is with your pencil or a black fine liner, going around the edges of all of your letters. That's another way, if you want to make them pop just a little bit more from one another, you can throw that in there as well. I hope that you had lots of fun with this serif style of lettering, and that you keep those keys in mind. Try to get all of your paint into the letters before it dries, add the water in afterwards to push the paint out to the side, and then you can come along and hoover some of that paint up. Then, once it's fully dry, and of course you alternate your letters, you can go in to add in your dark shadow line inside the letter and your very light shadow on the outside. Have fun, and I hope that you love this project.